It was raining. Of course, it was raining. I was the oldest in the group, and the game was introduced to me several camping trips back by some of my younger cousins. I don't know if this is a normal thing people play, but I'm sure there are countless versions of it out there under different names. I had never heard of it before, but it seemed relatively simple. It was called cougar, and it was essentially a variation on hide-and-seek, meant specifically to be played in the woods. One person would hide, while the rest of the group, preferably a large one, would have to walk forwards in a straight line away from the safety zone without stopping. The people in the group could only start running back to safety once someone spotted the hiding person and was able to point them out while shouting, "Cougar." The cougar, or mountain lion, or whatever you wanted to call it, would have to chase people down, and whoever they caught would become another cougar for the next round. This continued until only one person survived. This person, then, would be the next cougar. I suppose a lot of the fun came from the adrenaline of knowing you were intentionally walking away from safety, and by the time you found the person creeping up on you, it might be too late to turn back. Naturally, it only got more frightening the fewer people you had left in your group, and while it was easier to spot a cougar in time, they could also trap you in much faster. I wasn't much of a fan myself, but it did offer hours of entertainment, and so, every time I was forced into another family camping trip, aka me watching my younger cousins while the parents got to relax, cougar was pretty much always the go-to crowd-controlling maneuver. Of course, on this trip, I thought I would have to come up with something else as it began to pour outside. But by this point, the game was pretty much a tradition. "It'll be even more fun in the rain," they said. "We'll all get umbrellas and we can stop if we get too wet." We did have enough umbrellas. Living in Washington necessitates being ready for rain at all times, after all. And, plus, we weren't really camping. Whatever you call being in a national forest but just sitting inside pop-up campers with electric heating, then I suppose we were doing that. We weren't exactly in any danger of not being able to dry off, and the group overwhelmingly voted to give it a shot, even for just one round. I grumbled a few sarcastic lines to my cousin, Sarah, the only one old enough to actually offer me any company, but despite her giggles and my hesitance, we went for a round of the game anyway. There were no grizzly bear in Washington at all as far as I knew, but certainly no sightings in this forest for many years, and I had a laughable disregard for any small skittish black bears we had the minuscule chance of encountering. And so, ignoring the parents' request to stay close to camp, I led the kids a bit further than I might have normally, trying to find a part of the forest thick enough to at least block out most of the rain. The kids, of course, thought I was merely looking for a good spot to play the game and were ecstatic at the dense, mangled forest of hemlocks and pines we finally stopped at. Darkened moss hung from every branch and coated the forest floor in a sprawling, damp carpet. The sky was nearly invisible, dark, murky gray splotches above us through the towering pines. I reiterated the warning about poison ivy and stopping the game if a bear was spotted, and we set about a bracket system of rock, paper, scissors to determine the first cougar. After beating Sarah and begging her for a rematch so I wouldn't have to be the cougar, I unfortunately went on to win the rest, despite trying for the opposite. The pelting rain dripping from the trees overhead stabbed at our umbrellas with an audible, mistimed rhythm as I marked out the safe zone and direction the group would have to walk. I attempted to establish boundaries as well, but the forest was so eerily uniform for all of its complexity that I ended up having to say things like, "That tree with the weird thing," and "That patch of moss that kinda looks like a face." I doubted anyone really had a clear idea of what I was envisioning for the boundaries, but We were a big enough group, 7 kids not including Sarah and I, so I didn't see anyone getting lost without someone else being within shouting range. I sighed and readjusted my black umbrella, thankful for its dark color as I walked to find a hiding spot while the rest of the group huddled together with their eyes closed and counted down from 60. Maybe if I could just tag all of them fast enough, we could get through this quickly and go back to being dry. And that's when I remember nearly stepping on the nail. As my eyes wandered around the uneven ground ahead of me, I was somehow unable to see the broken plank of wood before I was right on top of it. I flailed my foot out of the way and cursed under my breath as I stumbled. I scanned the rest of the forest floor for any other potentially harmful objects, but didn't see anything else man-made. I rapidly dug the nail into the ground to keep it from stabbing someone and cursed at whoever the hell had thought to try and build something out all this way. With my remaining seconds, I frantically scurried behind a tree and listened for the group as their counting stopped, and everything grew nervously quiet. The floor was far too soft for footsteps to be heard, but I could still clearly hear them approaching as people giggled occasionally and shushed each other. Admittedly having a bit of fun now, I waited for them to just barely pass before starting a slow sneak just behind them. As a kid turned my way, however, I figured my cover was blown and feigned an evil laugh as I darted towards them. Screams and giggles exploded through the crowd as they scattered like flies. And dang, those kids are freaking quick. I only managed to grab 2 of the little buggers, Nick and Autumn, before the rest escaped back to safety. Sarah sneered and made a big show of her survival, but my own grin just widened as I pulled the 2 tagged kids aside and laid out the flanking plan to them. If the 3 of us could just stay hidden for long enough, we could trap the rest of them on all sides, no problem. I winced at the fact that Autumn had a pink umbrella while Nick and mine were black, but she assured me that she was a great hider. I just laughed and nodded. It was only a game after all. I warned the rest of the group about the nail I had found and to be careful of other sharp things that might be laying around. Several other kids mentioned finding wooden planks when scattering. One kid thought he saw a big pile leaned against a far-off tree, and someone else even mentioned kicking a rusty chain. I just nodded and re-emphasized for them to leave everything alone and watch out for stray nails. I looked to Sarah for confirmation, and she nodded, giving a thumbs up. Feeling better, I turned back to the 2 tagged kids and quickly pointed out their hiding spots as the rest of the group began counting down. We took off to our respective places, Nick and Autumn hiding a ways down the path on either side while I hung back and picked a spot where I could quickly follow behind the group. They finished counting, and I watched them all clutch their umbrellas closer as I began hesitantly walking forwards. Most of the kids seemed to have learned their lesson, unfortunately, and were now continuously looking behind themselves, forcing me to stay put. I couldn't see Nick at all anymore, but Autumn's pink umbrella was painfully visible as she crouched behind a tree. No one seemed to have seen her yet, but our cover was suddenly blown as Nick stepped out into the path directly in front of them, waving his arms. He wasn't carrying his umbrella. The group shouted and giggled as I immediately took off running back towards safety, only panicking and scattering as I stepped onto the path, blocking their way. And that's when Nick stood up from behind his tree, umbrella in hand, as he stared at the kid in the middle of the path. My heart staggered mid-beat, eyes watching the group rush past me in shrieking laughter, as the pale, dull figure in the middle of the path stood with wet hair, still waving its arms before giggling and running back into the forest. I didn't tag a single kid, just immediately looked to Autumn's umbrella again, and then back to Nick. I rolled around and counted the kids now laughing in the safe zone. I counted again, feeling my blood growing cold as I shook my head. We were all accounted for. I asked Sarah what cougar the group had seen, and she looked at me strangely, having assumed it was Nick as well. After more probing, I eventually got her to admit that she hadn't actually gotten a good look at his face, though it was definitely a kid. Calling Nick and Autumn back over, I ran my hands through my hair and took several long, sweeping glances of the forest. Was it some kid from another campsite? It definitely seemed childish the way they just jumped out and tried to scare everyone. Were they with an adult, or had they wandered off on their own? And with no umbrella. Nick finally reached me, confused as I was at who we had seen. I called into the forest several times, telling whoever it was that the round was over and if they wanted to keep playing they should come to the safe zone. No one answered. I waited for nearly a minute. And then Sarah pointed out that Autumn was going the wrong direction. I turned around to see her pink umbrella bobbing through the trees away from the group. I called for her, screamed, and yelled until it became apparent that she couldn't hear me, bright glow beginning to disappear behind dark trees. I cursed far too loudly for my young company and told Sarah to keep watch over the kids as I went after Autumn. She nodded in agreement and I began sprinting after the pink shape flickering in and out of view. I didn't make it far. As I ran along the path, something immediately caught my eye. The entirety of the forest was a dark, monotone green, but up against a tree in the distance, twisted and cocked at a bad angle, a pale, colorless figure lay bent backwards up against the wet bark. Her sticky, gray hair pressed against her open eyelids, jaw unhinged as it appeared to be snapped off against the trunk. As I felt rain begin to hit my head and my umbrella drop to my side, in jagged, sickly motions, Autumn's head continued to twitch ever so slightly. As I screamed to the rest of the group to get back to camp, as Autumn's pink umbrella still bobbed through the trees, and as the kid from before again jumped out and waved his arms to the group, screaming and laughing, the group did not scatter jokingly as before. Laughter did not mix with their shrieks, and hysteria left them to scramble towards camp in all directions. I still didn't get a good look at the child, but this time was enough to see that something was wrong with it. It was too thin, too pale, and too sunken. This child was not from the campsite, not from any campsite. This child hadn't eaten in weeks, hadn't seen sunlight in years. It screamed and laughed through a rotting, near-toothless mouth before giggling and darting away just as before. As I ran towards the group in terror, they began to spread out as they fled back to camp, and my heart was hammering so hard that the copper taste of blood began to make me sick. It was beginning to rain harder, and as water blurred my vision and pelting droplets drowned out screams and yelps, the best I could do was catch up to one kid as he tripped on some sort of metal hubcap and skinned his shin on the rock in front of it. It's okay, you're alright. I lifted him to his feet frantically, pushing him forward, stealing glances all around us. He began running again, at a slower pace, and though beginning to jog beside him, my eye again caught a pale, disturbingly gruesome form twisted on the ground. This one's arm was splintered beneath her as her head lay on a large rock, eyes staring upwards blankly. But she was breathing. I pushed the kid to keep moving as I scrambled over to the figure and knelt down in panic. Sarah's chest was rising and falling, but she was not quite conscious. The wound to the back of her head left thin, wispy trails of blood to snake down the rain-covered rock, and in her shocked delirium, she didn't seem to realize that her arm was bent the wrong way. As I tried to catch her wandering, blank stare by waving my hand, and I moved closer to shout her name, My leg kicked at something hard beneath me. It rattled and slithered across the ground with the force, stirring up dead leaves and pine needles. The chain led to Sarah's foot, and beneath the bloody debris, rusty, old metal sweated beads of water down its jagged surface. The two metal clasps weren't toothed with comically large triangles like you would see in cartoons. They weren't rounded off and circular like I had always imagined. No. A real bear trap wasn't like what I imagined at all. The jaws were just two dull, flat ovals, reaching so far up her leg they splintered her shin like it was a toothpick. The wound barely bled at all, but the skin of the impact was so black and rotten, her leg twisted so horribly that it was clear she was bleeding internally. My throat closed up as I stared helplessly at her shattered leg, the shock and disbelief the only thing keeping me from fainting. She, on the other hand, seemed seconds away from unconsciousness, eyes staring straight up as she did nothing but breathe shallow breaths. I immediately turned my attention back to the gruesome metal device, hands hesitating at the cold material as her legs sloshed beneath it, separated into two plates of bone. My eyes were stinging as I wiped wet hair from them and tried my absolute hardest to pry the jaws apart. They didn't even budge. Of course they didn't. I didn't know how to release a bear trap. Wasn't there supposed to be some way to disengage the springs or something? Did this even have springs? My eyes frantically searched its entirety, seeing nothing but metal surfaces and sharp, rusted edges. The chain was nailed to a tree with a large railroad spike, so slippery and rusted that my attempts to yank it out just left metal flakes to slide beneath my skin. I glanced again at Sarah to see her long gone, having slid off the rock and lying with her eyes closed. No twigs snapped. They were far too wet. The footsteps didn't carry on the soft, moist ground, no. I didn't see the child until it stepped on top of the rock and the pink umbrella lifted up from her torso to cover her face. Appallingly similar to the other child, her skin was so pale and stretched around her malnourished body that her tiny arms took on the shape of the bones beneath them. Her clothes were tattered and worn, and the only reason I knew it was a different child at all was because of the dark, stringy brown hair draping down from under the umbrella. Whether or not she could speak, I never knew, but the sound that came from her throat was like someone who had never heard laughter before attempting to replicate it. With that short, sickly bubble of haunted giggles, she bounced back around a grouping of trees and crouched down to hide, as if unaware I could still see the umbrella poking up. And then I did hear a twig snap. I did hear the ground squelch. And as I peered out from the trees surrounding the small ditch we lay in, what I saw approaching was not a child. Though obscured by the driving rain and thick brush, it was clearly the tall, stocky form of a large adult. I thought to call out to the silhouette, but immediately silenced the small peep that escaped my closed-up throat. Something wasn't right. It was breathing too heavy, walking too slowly, and just like the children, even this distant view was enough to suggest that its proportions weren't quite correct. So instead, I hid, flattened myself down next to Sarah's unconscious form, pressing my face to the cold, muddy ground. And I waited. The heavy breathing grew closer, and as it did, I watched the pink umbrella fold up and drop to the ground. The child curled up next to it, and it was only then that I realized it wasn't hiding from me. The squelching, wet footsteps grew louder, so close I felt like they were on top of me. damp bark sprinkled down as whoever it was pressed their hand to the other side of the tree I was behind. No more footsteps were audible, as it seemed to be searching around, or staring directly at me. My heart thudded so loudly I was certain anyone could hear it, and the more my ears craned, the more I felt my panic squeezing the air from my lungs. And then it moved. Footsteps starting away slowly, before picking up their pace into an all-out sprint. Shouts rang out from up ahead, calling for Autumn, Sarah, and myself. I slowly stood, vision pulsing with darkness from oxygen deprivation and adrenaline. I waved down the adults with shaking hands, watching as the pink umbrella opened back up and the girl darted away from the sounds, movement to my right signifying the other child following after her. They were both far away and again hidden by the time the first adults reached Sarah and I. We never returned to those woods. The police did, though. Teams of them. They didn't find the children nor the large man I had seen, but they did find a small, shoddy cabin a mile or so from where we had been playing. And all around the area, they found more traps and snares set up for wildlife. I never learned the details on Autumn's death, but it was likely the result of a pitfall landing her against that tree, or some sort of razor wire trip line. The cabin had been abandoned a day or so before the authorities arrived, and while neither the children nor the man were present, they did find a body inside, that of a young woman. Beneath the floorboards, a small hatch led to a confined cellar, several makeshift toys within. The whole story is up to the investigators to decide, I suppose, but I think I know what happened that day. And it makes me sick to think that those children, nearly completely blind from a childhood without light, tried to join our game, saw how we snuck up on each other and laughed. My heart squirms when I think they didn't realize what was wrong, eyesight too poor to see that the traps set for animals were killing us, playfully stealing the umbrella from Autumn as she tried to hide against that tree. And the way they hid from him. I don't know if the search brigade is still continuing, but I can't bear to think he found them before someone else did. I hope they're good hiders, after all.